Catherine Sterling did not deal in sentiment. She dealt in vertical assets, in leverage, in the clean, sharp lines of a profitable quarter. Her world was a cage of glass and steel suspended 48 floors above the city, a place where the grimy details of the terrestrial world were reduced to an abstract grid of potential. From this height, buildings were not homes or workshops, they were footprints, parcels on a map waiting to be aggregated, cleared, and repurposed for a higher, better use. Today's higher, better use involved a portfolio of distressed industrial properties her firm, Sterling Properties, had acquired in a hostile takeover of a failing regional bank. She swiped a manicured finger across the surface of a tablet, the images of rust-streaked warehouses and crumbling brick facades blurring past. Most were simple cases: bulldoze, remediate, build. One, however, was a nagging exception. This one, she said, her voice crisp and devoid of warmth. She tapped a satellite image of a low, sprawling brick building in a forgotten corner of the city's industrial periphery. Lot 7B. The old Voss facility. The environmental survey came back clean, but the structural report is a nightmare. It's filled with junk. Heavy machinery. The cost to clear and scrap it is estimated at $150,000. It's an unacceptable drag on the parcel's profitability. Her assistant, Marcus Thorne, a young man whose ambition was perpetually at war with his conscience, stood silently by her desk. He had read the file. The Voss Precision Mechanics building, he clarified softly. They were legendary, once. Catherine waved a dismissive hand, the gesture erasing a century of industrial history. Legends don't pay dividends, Marcus. I want this liability off our books. Put it up for a scrap and clear auction. Let some salvage crew pay us for the privilege of hauling away the garbage. List the starting bid at $1,000. I don't care if we get a penny more, as long as the contract stipulates the buyer assumes all responsibility for clearing the site to bare earth within 90 days. She looked up, her gaze as hard and polished as the marble floor. Solve this minor problem for me. Marcus nodded, the words catching in his throat. It felt less like a business decision and more like ordering the demolition of a cathedral to make way for a parking lot. But he knew better than to argue. Catherine Sterling did not appreciate complications, and she certainly did not appreciate history that could not be monetized. He retreated to his own smaller, less atmospheric office and began drafting the listing, a sense of profound waste settling over him like a fine layer of dust. Miles away, in a world that operated on a different scale and by a different set of laws, Elias Vance gently fitted the final gear into the back of an antique grandfather clock. His workshop was not a sterile box in the sky but a converted single-car garage attached to his modest bungalow. It smelled of machine oil, wood polish, and patience. Every tool hung in its designated place on the pegboard walls, their outlines traced in white paint. The space was small but orderly, a physical manifestation of a mind that thrived on precision and logic. Elias worked with an unhurried grace, his hands, though calloused from labor, moving with the delicacy of a surgeon's. The clock, a family heirloom belonging to his elderly neighbor, had not chimed in 30 years. He closed the rear panel, stood the heavy case upright, and gave the pendulum a gentle push. A moment later, a deep, resonant chime filled the quiet space. It was a sound of resurrection. "Is it done, Papa?" a small voice asked from the doorway. Elias turned and smiled, a rare but genuine expression that softened the stoic lines of his face. His 8-year-old daughter, Clara, stood there, her serious eyes taking in the scene. She held a book in her hands, her finger marking her place. "It's done, sweet pea," he said. "Mr. Henderson will be happy to hear it again." Clara nodded, her expression solemn. "He said it was his grandfather's. He said it remembers things." Elias knelt down to her level. "Well, now it can tell new stories." This was his life now. A quiet rhythm of small, meaningful repairs, of school runs and bedtime stories, of being the sole, unmoving anchor in his daughter's world. It was a life he had chosen, a life he had built from the wreckage of a different, faster, and louder existence. On a shelf behind his workbench, nestled between technical manuals, sat a framed photograph of a smiling woman with bright, intelligent eyes, her arm linked through his. An architect's drafting pencil was tucked behind her ear. The memory of his wife, Elena, was the silent, ever-present architect of this quiet life. Her sudden death 4 years prior had been the cataclysm that had caused him to walk away from it all, to trade a world of ambition and acclaim for the profound, singular responsibility of raising their daughter. He would not trade it back for anything. Later that evening, after Clara was asleep, Elias sat at his kitchen table, scrolling through local auction listings on an old laptop. It was a habit, a way to keep his mind sharp, to look for interesting mechanical puzzles. He mostly saw scrap metal, broken down farm equipment, and the sad remnants of failed businesses. Then he saw it. A single, grainy photo of a brick facade, the ghost of a name barely visible above the boarded-up entrance, Voss Precision Mechanics. The address leapt out at him. It was a place he knew not from a map, but from the marrow of his own professional history. It was where he had started, where he had learned, where he had become the engineer he was. Before he had become simply Papa, he was Dr. Elias Vance, lead systems engineer for Voss. He had been the protege of the founder, Oldman Voss himself, a genius of a bygone era who believed in building machines that would outlast the men who made them. Elias's name was on a dozen patents for high-precision gearing systems and automated fabrication tools, technologies that were considered revolutionary but too expensive, too robust for a market that was shifting toward cheaper, disposable alternatives. When the company had folded after the founder's death, its assets were scattered, its legendary workshop shuttered and left to rot. He had always wondered what became of the machines inside, the bespoke creations they had called the Series 7 line. He had assumed they had been scrapped or sold off in pieces years ago. The listing was for the building and its entire contents. Starting bid, $1,000. A cold, electric thrill, an emotion he had not felt in years, coursed through him. It was the feeling of a dormant part of his soul stirring to life. The next morning, he called the only person he still trusted from his old life. Ben Carter was a lawyer, a man who had navigated the shark-infested waters of corporate law before establishing his own small practice, preferring integrity over billable hours. He had been Elias's college roommate and one of the few who understood the magnitude of what Elias had walked away from. "Ben," Elias said, his voice even. "I need a favor." "Anything, Eli," Ben replied, the warmth in his voice immediate. "You finally ready to sue that lawnmower company for their shoddy engine design?" "I've been waiting for that call." "Something bigger," Elias said. He explained the auction listing. He did not need to elaborate on what the Voss factory represented. Ben knew. "My God, Eli," Ben said after a moment of stunned silence. "You think they're still in there?" "The Series 7s. "I don't know," Elias admitted. "But the cost to scrap them would have been astronomical. It was more likely they just locked the doors." "It's a long shot." "A long shot you have to take," Ben said, his voice now charged with energy. "What do you need from me?" "You want me to place the bid? Set up a shell corporation?" "Just a simple acquisition," Elias said. "In my name. I have the funds. I want it to be clean. And I need you to be there for the closing, if it happens. I have to be present." "Consider it done," Ben said. "You know, I always told you that your talent was being wasted on cuckoo clocks and vintage toasters." "They're good clocks," Elias said, a hint of a smile in his voice. He ended the call and looked around his small, perfect workshop. It felt different now. It felt like a starting point, not a final destination. The day of the closing arrived. The auction had been a quiet affair. No one else had bid. Why would they? The listing promised only a massive, expensive cleanup job. Elias's lone bid of $1,000 was accepted without ceremony. Ben had handled the preliminary paperwork, but the final signatures had to be done at the headquarters of Sterling Properties. Elias had insisted on being there. He needed to see the person who would so carelessly discard a legacy. He and Ben took the elevator up to the 48th floor. Elias wore what he always wore, clean but faded jeans, a dark blue flannel shirt, and sturdy work boots. He felt entirely out of place in the silent, opulent lobby, a world of polished stone and abstract art. He carried with him a worn leather satchel containing his checkbook and a set of his own high-precision calipers, a tool he never went anywhere without. Ben, in his sharp but unassuming suit, looked more at home but still seemed wary, like a man entering a predator's enclosure. They were shown into a vast conference room with a window that offered a god's eye view of the city. Catherine Sterling was already there, standing by the window, speaking quietly into her phone. She ended the call as they entered, her eyes sweeping over them with an expression of mild annoyance. She looked at Ben first, the lawyer, acknowledging him as a peer. Then her gaze fell on Elias. It lingered for a second, taking in his practical clothes, his calloused hands. A flicker of something, amusement, disdain, crossed her face before being replaced by a mask of bored professionalism. She did not offer a hand to shake. "You're here for the Voss property," she stated, not asked. She gestured to a stack of documents on the immense mahogany table. "My assistant will walk you through the signing. It's a standard as-is, where-is contract. Your responsibility begins the moment you sign." Marcus Thorne stepped forward, his face pale and his movements stiff. He avoided making eye contact with Elias. He opened the file, his hands trembling slightly. "Mr. Vance," Catherine said, the name sounding foreign and unimportant on her lips. She looked him up and down one more time. "I must confess, I'm curious. What does a person like you," she paused, letting the ambiguity of the phrase hang in the air, "plan to do with 100 tons of scrap metal? It seems like a rather ambitious undertaking for a small operator." A small, tight smile played on her lips, a smile that did not reach her eyes. She thought he was a junkman, a scrapper who had badly underestimated the cost of the job. Ben Carter tensed beside him, ready to speak, but Elias placed a subtle hand on his arm. He looked directly at Catherine Sterling. He did not smile. He did not frown. His face was a mask of placid neutrality. For a long moment, he said nothing, letting the silence stretch, letting her arrogance fill the space. The quiet in the room became heavy, uncomfortable for everyone but him. He was a man accustomed to silence, who understood its weight and power. Finally, he spoke. His voice was quiet, but it carried in the acoustically perfect room. "I have a use for it." That was all. The simplicity of the statement was a rebuff in itself. It offered no explanation, no justification. It was the statement of a man who did not feel the need to explain himself to her. A flicker of irritation crossed Catherine's face. She clearly expected deference, perhaps even gratitude. She turned to Marcus. "Just get it done," she snapped, before turning back to the window, dismissing them completely. She had already moved on to the next multi-million-dollar calculation in her head. The disposal of Lot 7B was a triviality, a piece of administrative lint she had just brushed from the lapel of her expensive suit. She had spent less than 4 minutes in their presence. Ben guided Elias through the documents. Elias read each page with methodical care, his eyes scanning the legal jargon with an engineer's attention to detail. When he was satisfied, he took a pen from his pocket, a simple, durable steel pen, and signed his name with clean, precise letters. He then opened his checkbook and wrote out the check for $1,000. He slid the documents and the check across the table to Marcus, who gathered them with a quiet sigh of relief. The transaction was complete. As they stood to leave, Catherine spoke again, her back still to them. 90 days, Mr. Vance. My legal team will be in touch on day 91 if the site isn't cleared. Don't be late. There was a threat coiled in the pleasantry. Elias paused at the door. He turned back, his expression unreadable. We won't be. He and Ben rode the elevator down in silence. As the doors opened to the ground floor, Ben let out a long, slow breath. The arrogance of that woman, he said, shaking his head. She has no idea. No idea at all. No, Elias agreed quietly as they stepped out into the bustling city street. She doesn't. He held a single, old-fashioned brass key in his hand, the key to the front gate of the Voss factory. It felt heavy, like the key to a kingdom. The factory stood like a sleeping giant, surrounded by a high, rust-streaked chain-link fence. The air of neglect was thick, but the building itself was solid. Old man Voss had built it to last, with brick walls a foot thick and a foundation that went deep into the bedrock. Elias used a heavy bolt cutter on the chain that held the main gate, the snap of the metal echoing in the quiet street. The gate groaned open on protesting hinges. He walked onto the property, the crunch of gravel under his boots the first sound of human activity the place had heard in years. He stood before the main entrance, a massive set of steel doors secured by a heavy lock. He inserted the brass key. It turned with a grinding reluctance, and the lock clicked open. He put his shoulder to the door and pushed. It swung inward with a deep groan, releasing a gust of stale, cool air that smelled of dust and dormant oil. A sliver of daylight pierced the gloom, illuminating a universe of dancing dust motes. Elias stepped inside, his eyes slowly adjusting to the darkness. The main workshop floor was vast, a cathedral of industry. High, grime-coated windows let in a diffuse, hazy light. The space was filled with hulking shapes shrouded in thick canvas tarps, all of them coated in a uniform layer of gray dust. They looked like statues in a forgotten tomb. For a moment, a sliver of doubt entered his mind. What if he was wrong? What if they really had been gutted, leaving only worthless husks? He walked to the nearest shrouded form, his footsteps echoing in the immense silence. He reached out and took a corner of the tarp. The material was stiff with age. He pulled. The tarp slid away with a soft, tearing sound, releasing a cloud of dust. And there it was. Bathed in a single shaft of light from a dirty window, it sat on its heavy iron base, a masterpiece of mechanical engineering. It was a Voss Series 7 multi-axis lathe. Its surfaces, protected by a film of dried cosmoline, were pristine. The complex array of gears, the precision-milled tool carriages, the massive headstock, it was all there, exactly as he remembered. It was not just a machine, it was an instrument, capable of a degree of precision that modern CNC machines, with all their computer-driven efficiency, still struggled to replicate. He ran a hand over the cold, oiled steel, a feeling of reverence washing over him. He moved through the cavernous space, pulling one tarp after another. It was a treasure trove. 4 more Series 7 lathes. 2 Series 7 vertical mills. A massive gear hopper, the only one of its kind ever made, capable of cutting helical gears to a tolerance of less than a micron. In a locked office at the back, he found what he was truly hoping for, the design archives. Rows of fireproof steel cabinets filled with schematics, blueprints, material specifications, and assembly notes for every machine Voss had ever built. It was the company's soul, its institutional memory, all preserved on archival vellum. Catherine Sterling hadn't sold him a building full of junk. She had sold him the entire legacy of Voss precision mechanics. She had sold him a resurrection. His first call was not to Ben, but to a man named Hector Ramirez. Hector was a machinist of the old school, a man who could feel a thousandth of an inch deviation with his fingertips. He had been the floor foreman at Voss, and when the company closed, he had been forced into early retirement, his skills deemed obsolete. Hector, Elias said when the older men answered. It's Elias Vance. There was a pause. Eli. It's been a long time. I heard you were fixing clocks. I am, Elias said. But I just bought a much bigger clock. And it needs winding. I'm at the old factory. Another silence, this one filled with disbelief. You're kidding me. I'm standing in front of your gear hopper, Hector. It's been waiting for you. An hour later, Hector's old pickup truck rumbled through the gates. The man who got out was older, grayer, but his eyes lit up with a fire Elias hadn't seen in years as he stepped into the workshop. He walked up to the gear hopper and laid a hand on it, as if greeting a long-lost friend. Madre de Dios, he whispered. 2 more calls brought 2 more men. David Chen, a brilliant but cantankerous systems specialist who could diagnose a faulty bearing by the sound it made, and Samuel Jones, a quiet, meticulous fabricator. They were the core of the old Voss team, men who had been cast aside by an industry that no longer valued their kind of deep, patient expertise. They arrived within the day, drawn by Elias's call and the promise of doing real work again. They stood together in the dusty light of the factory, a small, graying army assembled before their sleeping titans. There were no contracts, no discussions of pay. There was only a shared, unspoken understanding. This was more than a job. It was a calling. The work began the next day. It was slow, methodical, and deeply satisfying. The first task was to bring the building itself back to life. They patched the leaky roof, replaced the broken panes in the high windows, and rewired the main electrical panels. Elias, using his own savings, brought in industrial cleaners to wash away the decades of grime from the floors and walls. Slowly, the space transformed from a tomb into a proper workshop, light and air flooding the cavernous interior. Then came the machines. Each one was a project in itself. They were not restored, they were recommissioned. Under Elias's direction, they disassembled each machine down to its smallest component. Every gear, every bearing, every screw was removed, cleaned, inspected, and measured with his precision calipers. Parts that showed even the slightest wear were logged. Using the original schematics from the archives, they fabricated replacements on the smaller, still functional lathes and mills in the back of the shop. Hector, in his element, worked the gear hopper with a master's touch, his hands sure and steady. David, grumbling happily, recalibrated the complex hydraulic and electrical systems, while Samuel meticulously reassembled the heavy iron components with the help of an old gantry crane. Clara became a regular presence at the factory after school. She had her own small workbench in Elias's office, where she organized bolts and screws into labeled jars with a seriousness that mirrored her father's. She would watch the men work, her eyes wide with wonder at the scale of it all. She understood, in the profound way a child can, that her father was building something important. He was not just fixing machines, he was waking them up. Weeks turned into 2 months. The 90-day deadline from Catherine Sterling loomed, but it was an irrelevant concern. They were not clearing the factory, they were resurrecting it. The first Series 7 lathe was the first to be completed. After weeks of painstaking work, it stood gleaming under the new overhead lights, its dark green paint polished, its bare metal surfaces shining. It looked less like a machine and more like a sculpture. The moment of truth arrived. David completed the final power connections. Hector checked the lubrication reservoirs. Elias stood at the control panel, a place he had not stood in years. He engaged the main drive. There was a soft click of a contactor, followed by a low, powerful hum as the massive electric motor spun to life. The sound was deep, steady, and perfectly balanced. There was no vibration, no rattle. It was the sound of pure, harnessed power. Elias engaged the spindle, and the heavy chuck began to turn, its rotation so smooth and silent it seemed to be floating. He took a small cylinder of hardened steel and secured it in the chuck. With a touch of the controls, he brought a cutting tool to the surface of the steel. A single, impossibly thin spiral of metal, iridescent as a soap bubble, peeled away from the cylinder. He stopped the machine and removed the piece, handing it to Hector. The old machinist ran his thumb over the cut surface. He closed his eyes. "Perfect," he whispered. "It's perfect." They had done it. They had brought the legend back to life. Now, it was time to show the world. Ben Carter, who had been handling the formation of their new company, Vance Mechanics, used his network to arrange a private demonstration. He reached out to 2 specific contacts, a senior procurement officer from a major German aerospace contractor and the head of manufacturing for a prestigious Swiss watchmaking conglomerate. These were people who understood that the highest quality often came from the most unexpected places. They were men for whom precision was not a goal but a religion. They arrived on a Tuesday morning, 2 impeccably dressed Europeans looking skeptical and out of place in the industrial park. Elias greeted them not in his office, but on the workshop floor. He didn't give a presentation. He didn't use a slideshow. He simply led them to the restored Series 7. Hector stood by, ready. "The part you're holding," Elias said to the German aerospace officer, handing him a complex component from a landing gear assembly, "is currently manufactured using a 5-step process involving 3 different machines. It has a rejection rate of 7% due to microfractures that form during tooling." He then handed a schematic to Hector, who mounted a block of titanium alloy into the lathe. For the next 20 minutes, the 2 visitors watched in rapt silence as Hector, using the Series 7, machined an identical component in a single, continuous operation. The machine moved with a fluid, intelligent grace, its multiple tool carriages engaging the material in a perfectly choreographed dance. When it was finished, Elias handed the new part to the German. It was still warm. The man examined it with a jeweler's loupe. He checked it with a portable micrometer he had brought with him. He could not find a single flaw. The surface finish was like a mirror. He looked from the part to the machine, and then to Elias, his expression a mixture of awe and disbelief. "How?" the Swiss watchmaker asked, his voice hushed. "My company has spent millions on the latest CNC technology. We cannot achieve this level of finish in a single pass on this alloy. The machine is rigid," Elias explained simply. "The base is cast iron, aged for a decade before it was milled to eliminate internal stresses. The spindle runs on hydrostatic bearings. There is zero vibration. It cuts, it doesn't chatter. Oldman Voss believed in fundamentals, not shortcuts. The discussion that followed was brief and direct. They didn't just want to buy the parts. They wanted the capability. The German contractor placed an initial order for $5 million worth of critical components, with a clause for a long-term supply contract pending review. The Swiss watchmaker, however, made a different offer. He wanted to commission Elias to build him 2 new, smaller-scale Series 7 lathes specifically for his factory in Geneva. He was willing to pay $10 million for them. That evening, standing on the workshop floor with his small, loyal team, Elias held 2 signed purchase orders that totaled $15 million. It was more money than any of them had seen in their lives. But the look on their faces was not about the money. It was about vindication. It was the profound, quiet satisfaction of their skill, their knowledge, their life's work, being recognized and valued at its true worth. In her sterile office 48 floors above the city, Catherine Sterling was having a very bad day. A lucrative land development deal had hit a regulatory snag, and her quarterly projections were threatened. She was irritable and impatient, snapping at her subordinates for minor infractions. It was in this foul mood that Marcus Thorne chose to approach her. He held a copy of a highly specialized, subscription-only trade journal, Advanced Materials and Machining. He had been reading it during his lunch break, a habit from his engineering school days. "Not now, Marcus," she said without looking up from her screen. "I think you need to see this, Catherine," he said, his voice unusually firm. He placed the open journal on her desk. It was a small article, a single column on an inside page, under the heading Market Movements. It noted the surprising emergence of a new boutique firm, Vance Mechanics, which had secured a major aerospace contract for high-tolerance titanium components. It mentioned their use of restored, mid-century machinery to achieve unprecedented results. And it listed the address of their facility. Lot 7B. Catherine read the paragraph once, then twice. The name Vance pricked at her memory. The address was a cold spike of dread. She looked at Marcus, her eyes narrowing. "Get me the file for the Voss property disposal," she commanded, her voice dangerously quiet. Marcus already had it on his tablet. He handed it to her. She scrolled through it, her knuckles white. She saw the scrap and clear auction. The single bid. The buyer's name, Elias Vance. She saw the sale price, $1,000. Then she looked at the journal again, at the mention of a multi-million-dollar contract. The numbers swam before her eyes. The scale of her error, of her arrogant, dismissive misjudgment, was so vast it was almost incomprehensible. She had not just thrown away a few $1,000s in scrap value. She had thrown away a fortune. She had handed the keys to a kingdom to a man she had dismissed as a junk hauler. Her face, usually a mask of cool control, became a canvas of cold fury. "Who," she hissed, her voice trembling with rage, "was the acquisitions junior who flagged this property for disposal?" Marcus swallowed. "That would be Robert Jennings. From the regional bank's original portfolio assessment team. We kept him on after the merger." "Fire him," she snapped. "I want him out of the building in the next 10 minutes. Security escort. No severance." Marcus nodded numbly and retreated, leaving Catherine alone in the silent office. Firing the junior analyst was a meaningless, petty act of redirected fury, and she knew it. The fault was not his. He had followed protocol. The fault was hers. She had looked at a man in a flannel shirt and seen nothing of value. She had looked at a dusty old building and seen only a liability. She had failed to see. And that failure, that single moment of hubris, had just cost her firm millions, perhaps tens of millions. It was the single greatest professional mistake of her life. But Catherine Sterling was not a woman who accepted defeat. She saw a new angle. If this Vance was as brilliant as the article implied, then he needed to be working for her. She would buy him. She would absorb his company, take his technology, and reclaim the value she had so carelessly discarded. She would fix her mistake. A week later, a gleaming black sedan pulled up outside the now bustling Voss Vance factory. Catherine Sterling stepped out, dressed in a severe but impeccably tailored gray suit, an armor of wealth and power. The factory yard was no longer a wasteland of weeds and gravel but a clean, orderly space. The sound of productive, powerful machinery hummed from within. She walked through the open bay doors, her expensive heels clicking on the clean concrete floor. The scene inside stopped her for a moment. It was a place of intense, focused work. Men in clean overalls moved with quiet purpose between the massive, gleaming machines. It was not a dirty, chaotic workshop, it was a laboratory for titans. She saw Elias across the floor, not in an office but standing before one of the lathes, his head bent in concentration as he used a dial indicator to make a microscopic adjustment. He wore the same kind of simple, practical clothes as he had in her office. He was not directing, he was doing. She approached him, the hum of the machines a backdrop to her determined stride. "Mr. Vance," she said, her voice sharp, cutting through the noise. Elias finished his adjustment, then slowly turned to face her. He wiped his hands on a clean rag, his expression calm, patient. He did not seem surprised to see her. "Mrs. Sterling," he acknowledged, his tone perfectly neutral. "We need to talk," she said, getting straight to the point. "You have something I want. This technology, this capability. It's impressive. I underestimated you." It was the closest she could come to an apology, and it was still a statement of acquisition. "You underestimated the machines," he corrected her quietly. She waved that aside. "Semantics. Sterling Properties is prepared to make you a very generous offer. We will acquire Vance Mechanics. We will give you capital, resources, a global distribution network. You will have your own division, full autonomy. Name your price." She was not asking, she was informing him of his good fortune. Elias looked past her, at his team, at the machines they had resurrected together. He looked at the high windows where the afternoon sun streamed in, illuminating the space they had reclaimed. He thought of his daughter, Clara, doing her homework in the office, safe and close. He had everything he needed right here. He had built a world on his own terms, a world of substance and integrity. Her offer of money and resources was an offer to return to the world he had deliberately left behind. It was an offer of a gilded cage. He turned his gaze back to her. His silence was not a negotiation tactic, it was a period of consideration that she simply did not understand. He was not weighing her offer against a counteroffer. He was weighing her entire world against his. And the choice was simple. "No," he said. The word was quiet, but it landed in the space between them with the finality of a vault door closing. Catherine stared at him, momentarily stunned into silence. It was a word she rarely heard. "I don't think you understand." "I understand perfectly," he interrupted, his voice still quiet but now edged with a hardness she had not heard before. "You see these machines as assets to be leveraged. You see my team as human resources to be managed. You see the work we do as a product to be sold. We see it differently. What you are offering is not something we want." "Everything has a price," she insisted, a hint of desperation creeping into her voice. "Not everything," he replied. He turned back to his machine, his attention returning to the work at hand. The gesture was a clear and total dismissal, more profound than any insult. He had not raised his voice. He had not gloated. He had simply rendered her and her offer irrelevant. Catherine Sterling stood there for a long moment, a statue of expensive wool in a world of working steel. She was powerless here. Her money had no purchase, her status meant nothing. She had come to reclaim what she had lost, but she found that it was never hers to begin with. Defeated, she turned and walked out of the factory, the humming of the machine sounding like a chorus of quiet, indifferent laughter at her back. In the months that followed, Vance Mechanics flourished. They did not grow into a massive corporation. Elias had no desire for that. They remained a small, elite team, taking on only the most demanding projects from clients who understood and respected the quality of their work. They became a quiet legend in the worlds of aerospace, medical device manufacturing, and high-end horology, a company built not on a business plan, but on a philosophy. One of Elias's first major expenditures was not on new equipment or a corporate headquarters. He bought the small, empty lot next to the factory. It was a forgotten patch of urban blight, but he remembered a conversation years ago, sitting on his front porch with Elena. She had pointed to a similar neglected space in their old neighborhood and sketched out on a napkin her dream of turning it into a small, beautiful public park. He hired a landscape architect and, using Elena's old sketches as a guide, began the work. He and his team, in their spare time, fabricated elegant steel benches and a small, intricate gazebo in the center. A year after the day he had signed the papers in Catherine's office, a new sign was raised over the entrance to the factory. It was made of dark, oiled steel with letters cut with the flawless precision of a Series 7. It read, Vos Vance Mechanics. It was a bridge between the past and the future, a testament to the enduring value of a legacy rescued from oblivion. The story of Catherine Sterling's $1,000 mistake became a quiet cautionary tale whispered in the boardrooms she frequented. Her firm took a significant financial hit, not just from the lost opportunity but from the damage to her reputation for infallibility. She became more cautious, more brittle, the arrogance replaced by a thin, hard veneer of bitterness. She never recovered the kind of effortless dominance she once projected. One evening, Elias stood with Clara at the edge of the newly completed park. The sun was setting, casting long shadows from the young trees they had planted. Inside the factory, the lights were on, the machines humming softly as they completed an automated run. He was a man in his element, a master of a small, perfect universe of his own making. He had not set out to defeat Catherine Sterling. He had simply set out to build something of value. Her defeat was merely a byproduct of his success, a footnote in a story that was not about her at all. It was a story about the quiet, immense power of seeing the value that others could not, and the profound satisfaction of creating substance in a world obsessed with surface. It's pretty, Papa, Clara said, looking at the small park named in her mother's memory. Yes, it is, Elias said, putting his arm around her. He was wealthy now, a respected leader in his field, but in that moment, he was unchanged. He was still the quiet master of his trade, and he was still, first and always, a father. He had proven that the truest measure of a person was not in what they owned, but in what they could build, what they could restore, and what they chose to protect.